The Apple event just happened, and I have to say it's probably one of the more disappointing events that we've seen from Apple in many years. But with that being said, I am still going to talk about the actual event itself and what we actually saw from it. With the event, we saw the unveiling of the Series 9 Apple Watch, the Ultra 2, the iPhone 15, and then also iPhone 15 Pro. The Series 9 Apple Watch continues on with the same trend of just slight incremental upgrades, which for the Apple Watch does make sense, as most people aren't going to want to upgrade that every single year. It is definitely something that I'm considering upgrading to, primarily because I've got a Series 5, haven't really been using it recently. I used it a lot when I first got it, but recently I haven't really been using it, and I would like to just get a new Apple Watch, incentivize me to use it a bit more and try and get used to more of the higher spec and just a little bit better overall consumption. One of the better things with this device is that it goes up to 2000 nits of brightness, so it is very bright as a display, makes it a lot better for a lot of people, especially if let's say you're doing runs during like the full bright day, instead of let's say just sitting in your room all day. Outside of that, it is slightly more powerful as per usual, and then besides that, the biggest thing that they kind of spoke about for most of the event was the factor that it's their first carbon neutral product ever made. And I'm going to be talking about the whole carbon neutrality thing that they kept going on about the entire event later on. They then talked about the Ultra 2, which to be honest, there wasn't really much upgrade. I'll be honest. When you actually look at it on a surface level, there is still zero reason to either one, upgrade from the Ultra to the Ultra 2, and with that, even consider going for an Ultra 2 when the Ultra exists. There is no real point right now. I'd probably say anyone who is looking to get that watch, if you are, just go for an Ultra, as it's pretty much the exact same thing, it just doesn't have 3000 nits of brightness. That's the only big difference between the two products, which is probably why they spent as little time as they did talking about it. They then had the finger pinch feature, which I use air quotes to talk about the feature, primarily because after a lot of discussion within the first day, it turns out this is a feature that's already available for accessibility features on Apple Watches for ages now. So this is not a new feature, it's just been repackaged to be believed as such. So overall, Apple Watches wise, it wasn't too much of a big thing when it comes to really what we got. It's kind of part of why I say this was probably one of the more disappointing Apple events, as the Apple Watch hardly got any improvements, and I was expecting some things from what we got when it came to the leaks of the iPhone, and we're about to talk about it. However, due to the lack of much change as well with the iPhone, it led to a lot of disappointment. I'm just going to preface this by saying that I had an iPhone 11 Pro Max, I then went to an iPhone 13 Pro Max, then to a 14 Pro Max, primarily because I started making content for this channel talking about tech and so on, so I wanted to get that new phone so I could talk about it and such. So I'm going to do the same again this year for this phone, as I am interested obviously in talking about it. However, in regards to those changes, even though people said, for example, between the 12 and 13 there was no difference, that was a fundamental lie. If you actually look at the spec jumps and the battery power especially, there was a big difference. Between the 13 and 14, there wasn't that much, but they at least had, you know, the change in look by a little bit with the notch. And as well, on top of that, obviously, we had more power with the iPhone, but the main big feature of the 14 Pro Max was its camera. And then this year, when it comes to the Pro Max, which we will talk about in a bit, there's not really too much change. So we're going to quickly just talk about the iPhone 15, which the best way of summarizing it is that it's an iPhone 14 Pro Max or Pro, whichever one you go for in terms of size, just without the build quality, without the extra camera, and also without the better display. Is it worth it? Probably not. My best advice would be waiting a couple more months and see what the iPhone 14 Pro Max or Pro drops down to, because you could probably end up getting a better phone overall for either the same price or cheaper than the current mainline iPhone. It does also record in 4K at 60, which is something that they tried to hide away from showing and talking about with just the baseline 15, and they spoke about it within the Pro. It seemed very specifically mentioned, or at least not mentioned for the 15 and mentioned for the 15 Pro. Very odd. It was definitely something of a, I just glimpsed it when it popped up. I was like, oh yeah, it does 4K 60. I'm kind of surprised they didn't talk about it, and they talked about it in the Pro, and it's like, okay, you were definitely trying to act like this was an extra feature for the Pro, when in reality, it just wasn't. And then lastly, we did also get USB-C, which again isn't necessarily anything interesting. We all knew that it was either coming or they were going to go full wireless purely due to the EU regulations so that they could actually sell it. So obviously it happened, and we now have USB-C for the iPhone. Will it be interesting? Who knows? However, the biggest issue I do think a lot of people have with USB-C charging is that even though it is USB-C charging, we're going to be able to get the power of transfer speeds and all this sort of thing. the biggest thing that a lot of people would have expected with USB-C would have been that increase in charging speeds, which we're not seeing. It's going to be the same as Lightning anyway. So let's talk about the 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max. In terms of the biggest thing that was talked about on stage with this device, it has to be the titanium rails around it. I have to say, just from the video itself, it does look very nice. I genuinely do think the phone probably is the nicest looking iPhone that we've ever seen. I can't wait to get my hands on it as well personally, see how it feels. The only thing that puts me off slightly is that they said it's lighter, which for some may surprise you, is like, oh, why would you want it to be heavier? I personally like how heavy my phone feels. I like how heavy the 14 Pro is in comparison to the 13 Pro, for example. It makes it just feel that little bit more premium than, let's say, it might be. But with this one, obviously, they've improved the materials, but again, this is just the rails, as Marques Brownlee talked about in his video. It is just the rails. It's not necessarily the whole thing. It's not exactly going to make the whole thing more sturdier. It's just making the rails slightly better. Then on top of that, we got a more powerful chip, which is pretty cool, especially when you see that we're going to be able to play things like Resident Evil 4 and the remake, which is really interesting. And the last thing that they mentioned was that you're going to be able to play Assassin's Creed Mirage on it, which is really cool as the ability to be able to do so. It's definitely something that I will 100% test out on the phone. However, it's going to be something like, I feel like a Switch sort of scenario, where the Switch definitely runs games at a decent quality. However, due to how old the Switch is and how small it is, it's not necessarily something that can be done all the time and do it well anyway. And with that phone, it does come in at $999, which is a decent price. I'm actually going to be downgrading in terms of the size this year, as I kind of want to go for that smaller form factor this year, but also I don't really want to spend £200 so that I can have double the storage, a little bit bigger of a screen, and then the camera upgrade that they talk about with the Pro Max model, which obviously for some might be worth it, but for me personally, I'm never using up my full storage on my phone and I don't really care about that camera. We're talking about the 15 Pro Max. Let's talk about the pricing of it. It's $1,200 or £1,200 as well. It's going to be starting at 256 gigabytes, which basically just means that it is the same price for storage value as last year's models, but is a higher price than last year's baseline model of the phone. So it's something that you could definitely say is questionable. I feel like this was definitely, for the first time ever, seeing Apple's very much so, hey, this is the case of, we have so little to give you extras for the Pro models in general, let alone the Pro Max. We're just going to say to you, look, you get an extra little bit of higher quality camera. You also get a bit more of a powerful chip with the Pro models. Very slightly. It's not necessarily overly, like, even more powerful. It's okay in terms of more power. And then on top of that, what did we end up getting? Oh, you also get some extra storage. And it's like, well, it's not really extra storage. It's kind of all over the place. But we did also see that we're getting a 5 times optical zoom on that lens instead. So again, this is cool in terms of if you need it. But when it comes to it, will people actually be using this? Probably not. It might be useful for some, but for most, it won't be. And if anything, considering the price, you're better off waiting until probably next year for when you get the same phone, probably for even cheaper when it comes to the actual value for money, and hopefully better upgrades. And like I said earlier, this has to be the worst Apple event I've actually seen. It's the first time that I've watched an Apple event and I felt genuinely disappointed by what we saw. And on top of that, the lack of anything new, really. Obviously, we saw USB-C, but that doesn't really matter as Android have had it for years. Apple products have been slowly integrating it over time, and this was just the last product to get it. One thing that I did want to see, as Apple did do a patent for a folding phone, I wish we actually got something this year for it. I think this would have been the better year to have at least unveiled it, if they had it available, and not just wait until next year. Mainly, just that I think it would have at least covered up a lot of this, where we've basically got next to nothing of actual value for this new phone. At least with a folding phone, it would have been something more to actually talk about, to give us more things that would be really cool to discuss. But overall, this year seems like it's going to be very bleak for Apple. And the last thing that I do want to talk about, which very much irritated me throughout the entire thing, was the eco-friendliness part of it. Not necessarily the fact that they are an eco-friendly company or they're trying to get there. That's all great and all. But why did they spend so long in a tech-centered event? Something where they're meant to be talking about the new devices, all of this stuff. And they spent so much of it talking about how eco-friendly they are and how much they have done to make their devices eco-friendly, or as close to net neutral as they possibly can. It's something that obviously will be important for some and not as important for others. But in my opinion, this could have been saved for maybe a couple sentences here and there where they make subtle brags about it, or literally a 5-minute segment talking about it and that's it, leave it at that. Stop telling us about it throughout the entire event as if it's the only thing they had to talk about. There is also that. It was pretty much the only big thing that they could drop. A lot of people who are massive Apple fans, and I am someone who is a big Apple fan. However, this year I can't really defend them in any way. I think a lot of people will try, at least some people might, and they'll probably say, well, they talked about how good they are for the environment now and how they're trying to get there slowly. Yes, this year might not have been interesting for actual new tech. They're making everything as net neutral as possible. But again, why does that matter that much in a tech-centered event? For me, it just doesn't seem like something that needed to be on the stage for as long as it was. With that all being said, hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. If I get the new iPhone within the next week or so, I'll have a video unboxing it and talking about my first impressions of the phone, and then on top of that, my week later review and my month later review. So if that does interest you, make sure to leave a like on the channel, do subscribe for that, as more content will be coming very soon, and I'll see you guys next week for another video. Have a good one.